It's 7:30 on the evening of June the 18th, 1815. These are the final moments of the Battle of Waterloo, one of the most decisive military encounters in history. After hours of heavy fighting, Napoleon sends forward the Imperial Guard in one last desperate bid to defeat the Allied army under the Duke of Wellington.
Napoleon hadn't really been defeated in a great cataclysmic battle. There was a sense that somehow he'd been cheated, that somehow he was still the master of the battlefield. Waterloo ends that myth.
Waterloo has always been seen as a tactical victory for the Duke of Wellington. His small but highly trained Allied army outfighting the veteran soldiers of Napoleon's Grande Armée. But was there more to Napoleon's defeat than the tactics and fighting prowess of the Allies? Now the latest scientific techniques are shedding crucial light on Napoleon's campaign. And a dramatic archaeological discovery is helping answer the central question: what went wrong for Napoleon at Waterloo? In 1815, Europe had been at war for more than 20 years. Out of the chaos of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte had forged an empire on the battlefields of Europe. Victory had followed victory, and Napoleon seemed unstoppable. But by 1815, time and war had taken their toll, and the great powers of Europe had finally united to rid themselves of Napoleon once and for all. As the massed armies of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia closed in, Napoleon launched a desperate preemptive strike.
For Napoleon, the clock really is ticking. He desperately needs peace. He can't get it. And what he's got to do is he's got to defeat the Prussians and the British, but particularly the British, before the huge mass armies of the Russians and the Austrians descend upon him. Because once they descend upon Paris, Napoleon's had it.
On the night of the 17th of June, 1815, the Duke of Wellington prepared his troops to face Napoleon's Grande Armée. Taking up position at Waterloo on the southern outskirts of Brussels, the 90,000 British and Allied soldiers awaited the attack of Napoleon's 120,000-strong French army. Heavily outnumbered, the Allies' only hope was to link up with Blucher's Prussian army. But as day dawned on the 18th, the Prussians were still several hours' march from Waterloo. If Napoleon could move swiftly, the odds would be stacked in his favor. But the longer he delayed, the greater the chance of the Prussians coming to the Allies' aid. For Napoleon, the clock was ticking. The battlefield today seems miraculously unaffected amidst the suburban sprawl of Brussels. In the tense days building up to the battle, Wellington would have surveyed this scene and identified the ideal defensive position to stop Napoleon.
Throughout the period that Wellington is in Flanders, he is constantly thinking, if Napoleon comes, where will he come? Which routes will he adopt? Where, therefore, can I stop him?
Wellington had an expert eye for terrain. He drew up his army along the crest of a ridge where the main Brussels road crossed the Waterloo Valley. But today, it's difficult to tell precisely how good Wellington's position was, because contrary to appearances, the landscape has changed. It's now dominated by a giant artificial hill called the Lion Mound. Thousands of tons of soil were scraped away to create this 40-meter-high mound, a huge earth monument to the Dutch and Belgian troops who died at Waterloo. Wellington was furious at how the construction of the mound destroyed his battlefield.
Wellington went back to the battlefield of Waterloo and he saw that mound. And he said to one of his companions, Colonel Gurwood, he said, "Damn me, Gurwood, they've ruined it. Them Hollanders have ruined my battlefield." Or words to that effect. He was furious.
But why was Wellington so incensed? What was it about his Waterloo position that construction of the Lion Mound destroyed? What made the position so effective was the ridge. With his troops lined along its crest, Wellington knew that the forward slope provided a clear field of fire and a steep natural obstacle against attack, whereas the reverse slope sheltered his troops from incoming fire. So how much did the removal of topsoil for the Lion Mound change this distinctive ridge? Landscape archaeologist Paul Hill suspects the ridge is now much lower than it would have been in 1815. Contemporary prints of the area prior to the mound's construction provide Paul with valuable clues as to what has changed. Roads are usually depicted as having steep embankments on either side. But to the east of the Lion Mound, the O'Hain Road now has an embankment on only one side.
It's very clear that there's been a major change in the land formation here. I'm standing on top of a large bank on the north side of the main O'Hain Road, the east-west road. If we look further to the south on the other side of the road, you can see there isn't a bank at all, and there should be one there at least as high as this one. If we can recreate this landscape and see the level of the slope up which cavalry and infantry have to run, we can see why Wellington chose such a position to defend.
But to prove his theory, Paul must somehow create a view of the landscape as it appeared to Wellington on the day of the battle. Specialist help is required. He calls in surveyors James Kavanagh and Dan Schnurr. Using a revolutionary new survey technique, the team will create a terrain-accurate 3D computer model of the battlefield. The result should be a unique impression of how the Waterloo landscape appeared to Wellington in 1815.
Okay, this gives us a nice clear view over the battlefield. So when we're surveying, we'll be able to stay in radio contact with this base. And then this little nail is the reference point for the whole battlefield survey.
The geomatic system uses the network of GPS satellites to relay signals between the team's backpacks and this base station. James and Dan are then free to roam, surveying the land to millimeter accuracy whilst on the move.
Okay, that's got the base station started.
Ready? Okay, see you later, Dan.
From the start, it's clear the Waterloo terrain is deceptive.
The most amazing area of the battlefield here, it's got all these low points. So as you're coming up through this area of the battlefield, it would appear that no matter where you were, you'd always be in a slight hollow, and then you'd have such difficulty getting up onto the ridge lines. It's very, very difficult terrain. It makes me wonder whether Wellington was a surveyor.
But James isn't the first member of his family to struggle through the mud at Waterloo.
Yeah, well, we had a sword in the family which is from Waterloo. With one of my ancestors' names on it, my probably great-great-great-grandfather who fought on the French side. So we must have been here on the big day, as it were. But he managed to escape.
It's unbelievable. It's boggy ground, it's really soft. Unbelievable. I don't know how they fought on this. It's bad enough making a map.
With the survey complete, all that remains is for the team to interpret the data and reveal for the first time just how the battlefield of Waterloo really appeared in 1815.
Right, chaps. Oh, yeah.
It's the early hours of the 18th of June, 1815. Napoleon is under pressure to attack, knowing that every minute he delays brings the Prussian army closer. Across the valley, the Duke of Wellington positions his Allied army on the Waterloo Ridge, awaiting the inevitable French attack. But what was it Wellington had seen in the terrain which made Waterloo such an ideal position for defense? Paul Hill is confident that the battlefield survey will provide an answer. When the results are plotted, the first stage is to show the battlefield as it is today, including the Lion Mound. The area where Paul believes the topsoil was removed from then shows up distinctly.
You can clearly see this circle here is the mound. And you can see quite clearly that that's been snipped off there and then pushed up. And I think by taking out the mound, we can actually get a flat area where we think most of this earth has come from.
But it's not until the Lion Mound is removed and its volume redistributed over the truncated area that Paul gets the evidence he needs. The model reveals that the Waterloo Ridge was in fact much steeper before the construction of the Lion Mound.
We can see from the model this original ridge along the top. It just gives such a commanding view over this entire area, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, when we were there, do you remember trying to walk up this slope?
Yes.
And now, not only have you got to walk up how it is today, but you've got another sort of, 100 meters of slope to keep going.
Essentially what it's given you your battlefield back.
Still deceptively steep, the forward slope would have been an even more difficult obstacle in 1815, whilst the reverse slope would have provided precious concealment and shelter for the Allied troops behind the crest.
Despite the fact that there was a bit of truncation off the top here, we're still looking up what I think is generally speaking, the same aspect that the people had when they were coming up here. And it's a classic forward and reverse slope situation because you can't see anybody lined on the ridge up there. In fact, looking down here, even now with the truncation, you can just see the top of those telegraph poles. Well, that's what it must have been like for them. It's still a formidable slope, and waiting on the other side, of course, were the British infantry.
It's clear that Wellington's position was expertly chosen, giving the Allies the terrain advantage. But Napoleon still had more troops and greater firepower. As the Prussians marched ever closer, why did he still not attack?
If you read the accounts of the time, you sense a feeling that they wanted to get on with battle. The French were very, very confident.
Meteorologist Dennis Wheeler is fascinated by the impact of weather on major moments in history. He's convinced that the weather holds the key to understanding why Napoleon delayed. He's determined to do something that has never been done before, reconstruct precisely the weather on that day.
Well, naval logbooks contain a rich source of data, data not recorded just every day, but sometimes every hour. But it's not instrumental data, it's the observations made by officers on board deck. So you do have a very detailed picture of how the weather each day evolved almost hour by hour. It's a bit like looking at a modern day weather forecast, but written in 18th and 19th century terms. So what we have here is a piece of detective work. We've got data from different sources, we need to gather it together, and once we've got those individual pieces of information together, we can plot them on a map, and from it we can begin to reconstruct a weather map, rather like the sort of weather map we'd be all too familiar with from the television forecasts of today.
Dennis's detective work has established that in the 48 hours leading up to the battle, a low-pressure ridge brought torrential rain to the Waterloo area.
The night before the Battle of Waterloo, the weather could be described as apocalyptic. It looks as if it rained consistently through the night, and it was still raining at dawn. But sometime between 8 or 9 o'clock, the rain ceased, the sun came out, and the conditions began to become much clearer, and certainly a great deal drier.
With the clearer weather, the way seemed open for Napoleon to launch an immediate attack on the Allies, spearheaded by his most feared tactic.
The classic Napoleonic ploy for a battle is always to begin with an artillery bombardment. French artillery was very good. There were good guns, effective guns, and there were plenty of them.
Napoleon's beloved artillery was the most feared in the world, and its immense firepower was more than sufficient to blast Wellington's troops from their positions on the ridge. But even though the rain had stopped by morning, it had left a big problem for Napoleon.
When you're in the hollows around here, you've got really sticky, claggy mud. The problem is you've got a geology around here that's silty loams, and when they get wet, they get very wet and very slippery. I cannot get my shoe out of the mud, and that must have been exactly what it was like. But the mud itself, if you look at it carefully, it's incredibly fine. But when it's wet like this, these fine particles clag together, and it just becomes like putty.
Had the battle been fought only 30 to 40 miles to the southwest, we'd have had a very different situation. Nice chalky downs which would have drained very quickly indeed. But this is just the wrong area to fight in when it's been raining.
But why should mud be more of a problem for Napoleon than for Wellington?
On the morning of the 18th of June 1815, this gun was part of Napoleon's ground battery. Now, this is about as good as it gets. This gun was manufactured in 1813, it's a 12-pounder, and this should have given an artillery general like Napoleon a decided advantage. But it's very heavy. This is going to take, in ideal conditions, about 8 men to move it. That's when the ground is baked hard. But on the morning of the 18th of June, of course, the ground was like a quagmire.
Napoleon knew the sodden ground would make it difficult to maneuver his big guns, and he was gripped by a terrible dilemma. Knowing every minute's delay could be potentially disastrous, he decided to wait several tense hours for the ground to dry out. But with the Prussians closing in, was this a wise decision? What would have happened if Napoleon had pushed on through the mud regardless? By waterlogging and ploughing up an area of terrain, a team from the Royal Artillery simulate conditions on the Waterloo battlefield. They aim to investigate just how difficult it would have been for Napoleon's gun crews if he'd sent them into action without waiting for the ground to dry out.
Stand by! Go! Come on then!
Moving the heavy 12-pounders forward into position would have been just the start for Napoleon's gunners. After every shot, the half-ton guns would have had to be run back through the mud, the massive recoil having blown them yards back out of position. In the opening bombardment at Waterloo, the crews would have had to sustain this workload for an hour or more, each gun firing more than 100 rounds. The Royal Artillery team gets a taste of the fatigue caused by manning a 12-pounder at Waterloo in a point-to-point relay for just 10 minutes, a fraction of the time the French crews were in action.
Stop!
Steve Myers is a sports physiologist. By monitoring the soldiers' heart rates and blood lactate levels, he's able to measure the level of fatigue they experience.
It was a very good test. I mean, they worked incredibly hard.
During strenuous exercise, lactic acid gradually builds up until muscles tire and seize.
The lactate levels here are like maximal lactate levels. Really, you get off sort of test to exhaustion on a treadmill, these kind of levels you expect to see.
The soldiers' heart rates, too, are close to the maximum, around 180 beats per minute.
The heart rates we've got up here, interestingly what it shows is they're all, close to maximal heart rates there. The sort of aerobic, fat-burning type exercise range. We saw our well-trained British gunners doing this, and they were really tired at the end of it. If you take the French artillerymen firing those guns, there's no chance that they wouldn't have been, they wouldn't have been affected by fatigue. They would have been very, very tired, and they wouldn't have been able to maintain the sort of rates of fire.
With dozens of exhausted crews repeating this process alongside each other, the firing of the Grand Battery would have become sparser and the gun line itself steadily more disorganized. It's clear Napoleon made the right decision in delaying his attack. If he'd pressed on, his prized artillery could have collapsed. But he must still have been confident of the overwhelming firepower of his heavy guns, his beautiful daughters, massed together in one grand battery, ready to smash the Allied line. Finally, around midday, the French guns opened fire.
The great bombardment opens up classic Napoleonic start to a battle. Lots of fuss and feathers, lots of noise, lots of smoke, very little effect.
Despite its huge firepower, the Grand Battery was still not as effective as it should have been. Something else was going wrong. Wellington's troops were sheltered by the reverse slope. But as well as solid cannonballs, the French were also using explosive shells, fired over the ridge crest to fall down, bursting amongst the Allied soldiers. Shellfire should have been devastating, so why at Waterloo did it have so little impact? Major Simon West is an expert on the artillery weapons used at Waterloo. He's been trying to find out why the French shellfire was so ineffective. To be sure his experiments are accurate, Simon has had hollow iron shells made, exactly like those used by the French at Waterloo. Shells were designed to burst apart, sending heavy lethal fragments in all directions. In normal conditions, this would inflict heavy casualties, but at Waterloo, the conditions were anything but normal. On Salisbury Plain, he simulates the ground conditions at Waterloo. Simon buries a 6-inch shell containing nearly 2 pounds of gunpowder, only feet away from a target representing a line of Allied soldiers.
3, 2, 1, fire!
Well, this is brilliant because it was buried just below the surface, as it might have landed if it was coming in at a decent angle and buried a bit. The energy of the explosion has been absorbed by the ground and had no effect on the target, only feet away.
Amazingly, the target has escaped virtually unscathed. Although his guns pounded on, it's clear the wet ground severely reduced the effectiveness of Napoleon's Grand Battery. Wellington's troops had only to sit out the heavy bombardments behind the sheltering ridge. They knew that eventually the French infantry would be forced to attack across the muddy valley and up the hill. The densely packed French columns would make ideal targets for the Allied cannonballs and shells. And the Allies had another weapon, one that was not affected by the weather, the most feared of all artillery weapons: canister. It's 1 p.m. Napoleon's artillery has failed, thanks to the wet ground and Wellington's use of the sheltering terrain. But with the Prussians now close by, Napoleon dare not delay. He launches his heavy infantry attack. Advancing steadily across the muddy, exposed valley, the French soldiers have no cover. They're easy targets for Wellington's Allied artillery, above them on the ridge. The French soldiers struggle into a storm of lethal, close-quarters artillery fire. Using an original Waterloo British cannon that has not been fired in more than a century, Major Simon West investigates just how effective the Allied cannonballs would have been on Napoleon's densely packed troops. He'll load it with a 6-pound solid iron round shot, exactly what the Allied gunners would have used against the ranks of French soldiers, represented by the target 100 yards away.
Okay, right, first shot in 150 years.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire!
At over 200 meters per second, the round shot is devastating. The solid iron balls would have ploughed through the packed French ranks, a single shot killing or wounding as many as 10 or 15 men.
Now, seeing the shot fired out of the cannon there, you think of that 6-pound shot having so much energy. There's no doubt that if that engaged sort of rows of cavalry or infantry in column, it would reap horrendous havoc.
But destructive as round shot could be, when the surviving French infantry closed in to point-blank range, the Allied gunners switched to the most feared artillery device of all, canister.
What I'm going to do is make up some canister charge. Canister was literally musket balls inside a thin-walled metal tube.
Simon wants to find out just why this anti-personnel device was the terror weapon of the Napoleonic Wars. The metal tube burst apart as it exited the cannon's muzzle, creating a huge shotgun effect.
Fire.
Well, considering that that frontage represents probably 6 men in file, not one of them has escaped injury. And bearing in mind that each of those balls is travelling at over 100 metres per second, even out at this range, that's going to represent a fatal injury.
Any French infantrymen lucky enough to survive the artillery fire still had to face Allied musketry. British infantry in particular were renowned for their disciplined clockwork volley fire, and at close range, their muskets could be just as deadly as canister fire. But not all soldiers' injuries at Waterloo were fatal. Retired surgeon Mick Crumplin is an expert on Napoleonic battlefield medicine. He's looking at the work of those other people on the battlefield, the French and Allied doctors. How they treated the injured, especially the walking wounded, could have a significant effect on the outcome of a battle. In order to replicate the kind of wounds surgeons would have had to treat, Mick commissioned sculptor and a ballistics expert Ivan Williams. He's designed an artificial torso to take the place of human flesh and bone. Ivan shoots the torso using 3/4-inch lead musket balls from an original Waterloo period weapon. Using original 19th century surgical instruments, Mick will then attempt to show how the injuries would have been treated.
Well, I think these are just typical of the sort of wounds that would have been inflicted at the Battle of Waterloo and a surgeon would have to deal with. Of 6 injuries, one would surmise that 3 were definitely instantly fatal, 1 was presumably fairly soon fatal, and 2 were survivable with good management. The chest injuries, you can see there are 4 entry wounds. The surgeon would approach these and, as with most wounds, he would put his finger into the wound to see if the chest cavity was breached and the depth of the wound. He could use a silver probe. And you can say instantly that these 3 wounds would be mortal. Solid missiles or pieces of bone would be relatively easy to extract from a wound, as there's something to grip on, which is in great contrast to soft things like clothing and bits of belt and so forth. Using contemporary instruments, you can see that this is a relatively easy exercise.
Battlefield surgery in 1815 was primitive by today's standards, but it's always been believed that Napoleon's army had a big advantage. Celebrated French experts, such as Baron Dominique Larrey, Napoleon's personal surgeon, were thought to have developed a much more advanced system of military medicine than any other contemporary army. Throughout the Waterloo campaign, their groundbreaking treatments were thought to have speeded up the return of badly needed men to the front line, contributing much to the soldiers' morale. This could have given Napoleon the edge over the Allies. So why wasn't this the case? Mick Crumplin believes that by 1815, the British and Allied surgeons at Waterloo had become just as proficient as the French. He studied the extraordinary work of Charles Bell, a civilian British doctor who carefully recorded the injuries he encountered at Waterloo and the treatments he carried out.
Charles Bell was an anatomist, artist and surgeon from the Middlesex Hospital who travelled out, amongst others, and he made 47 drawings on vellum of wounded men. The illustrations showed dress, countenance, shock, infection in the men's faces. It's an invaluable collection. It is really the photography of the Battle of Waterloo.
By 3 o'clock, the ground had begun to dry out, and the disadvantages the French artillery had suffered in the morning were reduced. But just when it seemed the French were about to regain the advantage, Napoleon himself caused the battle to take a fateful turn. Crucially, at some time between 2 and 3 o'clock, Napoleon left the battlefield. Exactly why he did this at such a critical stage is still a mystery.
There is clearly something not right with Napoleon this day. He's complaining constantly about the pains in his stomach. He's easily exhausted. This is a man in middle age who's beginning to suffer all the ailments of the middle-aged and is very conscious of it all the time.
Whatever Napoleon's condition, he was absent from the battlefield for nearly 2 hours, returning to his headquarters at Rossomme, nearly 2 miles away. He left control of the embattled French army in the hands of his second-in-command, Marshal Ney.
Ney was a superb soldier at the tactical level. If you wanted a charismatic leader to draw his sword and say to his men, "Follow me for glory," Ney was your man.
But Napoleon could hardly have chosen a worse moment to hand over command.
At about 3 o'clock, Ney looks up there onto the ridge, onto the right-hand side of the Anglo-Dutch position, and he thinks he sees the Allies retreating.
No one's absolutely certain what happened, but the best historical theory is that Wellington was adjusting some of his battalions, as he did during the course of the battle, moving some out of the firing line, moving them back to a reverse slope position. And it seems clear that Ney saw this movement taking place and thought, right, they finally cracked, they're beginning to move exactly as we always thought they were going to, and then orders an unsupported cavalry charge.
Ney thought the critical moment had come, that the French artillery had finally broken the Allied line. Whether he was unsighted by battlefield smoke or by his own sheer impetuosity, Ney seized his chance and acted.
He turns to the nearest cavalry brigade commander and he says, "Take your brigade, capture the plateau." And the cavalry brigade commander says, "No fair, Gov," or whatever the French equivalent is. Ney loses his temper, very typical of Ney, grabs Miho, who's the cavalry corps commander, and says, "Miho, take your cavalry, capture the plateau, go now."
Not only does he commit that brigade of cavalry, he commits the entire cavalry corps. So within the space of the next 30 to 40 minutes, thousands of French horsemen are committed to the battle on an area where, frankly, there is insufficient room for 2 regiments to charge. And suddenly you have 8 regiments, 12 regiments, 16 regiments.
Ney himself personally takes post ahead of them, waves his sword in the air, and the whole of the cavalry moves off down the hill and up towards Wellington's Ridge.
It was an amazing spectacle, one of the biggest cavalry attacks of the Napoleonic Wars. 5,000 sabres knee to knee, climbing the slope to put the Allies to flight. But the Allies had not broken. As the waves of French cavalry crested the ridge, they found Wellington's infantry in position on the reverse slope, formed in impregnable squares. The Allied artillery was waiting for them. The French cavalry attacked again and again, but it was impossible for them to break through the disciplined squares. Ney had made a catastrophic error of judgment.
Napoleon comes back from Rossomme, takes a look and says, "What on earth are we doing?" He then starts to organize some artillery and some infantry to put up in support of the cavalry, but it's too late. and the flower of the French cavalry is blown away.
Hundreds of cavalrymen and horses were killed or wounded, and the exhausted survivors played little further part in the battle. It was a disaster for Napoleon. With Prussian troops now closing in, the French were forced to fight on two fronts. Napoleon had lost the advantage. But the truth is, just as he was not the commander he once was, his army was not the fighting machine it once had been. To find out what had gone wrong with the Grande Armée, we need to go back further to the years before Waterloo. An important clue lies in a dramatic archaeological discovery in Lithuania. Just 3 years earlier, in 1812, Napoleon had embarked on the disastrous Russian campaign. More than 500,000 men marched with their emperor into Russia. It was an army of well-trained professionals, the veterans of Napoleon's most famous victories. But fewer than 1 in 10 French soldiers returned. And in spring 2002, building workers in the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius, found the last resting place of some of them. 2,000 French soldiers lie buried here in a single pit. It's the largest mass grave of Napoleonic soldiers ever found.
When we excavate such a thing, we always have a strange feeling that all these persons died and were just thrown into some kind of mass grave. It must have been something like a terror vision when they were fresh corpses.
For the first time, archaeologists can discover what kind of men made up Napoleon's Grande Armée at the height of its power.
Here you see the remains of uniform, and there's green traces. There are most probably traces of button. Just this discoloration of bones. These are from artifacts.
The soldiers had been buried in their uniforms, enabling the archaeologists to piece together the clues as to who they were. They were able to work out that these were men from the prime regiments of the Grande Armée, including Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard. And their bones revealed something else. These soldiers were not diseased. They'd been in good general health when they died.
Also young individual. Teeth are all healthy. You see the third molar just was erupting.
Aged mainly in their early to mid-20s, these were the prime soldiers of the Grande Armée, the young men who had carved out an empire for Napoleon.
It is something like the cream of the French army, actually. And even these ones, who were the strongest and the best soldiers at this period, died here during this campaign.
But the evidence that the cream of Napoleon's army died in Russia is not all that the skeletons in Vilnius reveal. Mysteriously, few of these young soldiers died of wounds. Archaeologists were at first baffled as to why they were buried in Vilnius, where there is no record of a major battle during the 1812 campaign. However, research soon showed that a much more poignant fate had befallen them. These were the men who had survived the Russian campaign. They had escaped to what they thought would be safety, and yet what actually awaited them in Vilnius was a terrible death from starvation and hypothermia. And the commander who had to stand by and watch his men die was Marshal Ney. Could the traumatic experiences that Ney suffered here in Vilnius hold the key to what went wrong for Napoleon at Waterloo? By 6:30 in the evening, the Battle of Waterloo is approaching its final bloody climax. As Prussian troops fight their way towards the Allies, Napoleon is more and more dependent on his second-in-command, Marshal Ney. But after the disastrous cavalry charges of the afternoon, Ney is becoming increasingly reckless. Mike Robinson is intrigued by Ney's erratic behavior at Waterloo. He suspects the legendary marshal, known as the bravest of the brave, may have played a crucial part in Napoleon's defeat in the battle.
Ney always led from the front. He was in the thick of it, he was in the smoke, he was in the musketry. He was a man who was so wholly involved in the battle itself that he lost sight of what was going on around him. And his passion was roused to such an extent that he lost his own self-control. He made lots of quite serious mistakes of a tactical nature throughout the day.
A veteran of more than 70 battles, Ney had always been one of Napoleon's most dependable commanders. Having joined in the ranks as a humble trooper, he was promoted general before he was 30 and made a Marshal of France by Napoleon when he was 35. But after the horrors of the Russian campaign of 1812, Ney became steadily more unpredictable.
It's difficult to tell after this lapse of time just how much that affected his later performance. Certainly he was prone to make more mistakes, both on a strategic and a tactical level. He was prone to greater outbursts of fury or passion or temper, and he was slower to calm down. And certainly his performance on the day isn't what you would expect from the man who you want to lead your army to victory.
Can modern psychology shed light on Ney's behavior? To test his theory, Mike assembles a panel of leading military psychiatrists, experts in identifying symptoms of combat fatigue in modern service personnel.
The picture that we have of Ney in the closing stages of the Battle of Waterloo is a man on the lower slopes of the Allied Ridge. He's lost his hat, he's had 5 horses shot from underneath him. He's striking the barrel of a cannon with the flat of his sabre. I can't see that as normal behaviour in someone exercising that rank and those responsibilities.
The picture you've just described is a man who's just lost it completely, who is just lashing out, who's out of control, which is in stark contrast to what he should be, even as a lieutenant or a colonel. You know, he's supposed to be in command, most of all of himself.
But could Ney's crucial loss of self-control during the battle have been due to a psychological complaint, similar to what is now recognized as combat stress? Not everyone agrees.
In terms of latter-day thinking, from the First War onwards, battle shock, combat stress, shell shock, really it's a functional diagnosis. In other words, can they function? He functions. But he didn't function as a leader. Yes, he did. In the sense of overall command, he functioned as a leader, a very junior leader, but not as a senior leader. No, he functioned as he'd always functioned. He would always be at the front. He was the last man to step out of Russia. I don't think this is behaviour that's incongruent with him.
We have to be careful not to get into a situation where we see the diagnosis as an incapability element, that that these are people who are incapable of doing things. But what's happening is he's not thinking straight. Now that's okay. If you're a private soldier, that doesn't particularly matter. If you're a general, that's a big problem.
But having discussed the evidence, do the group believe that Marshal Ney was psychologically unfit for command?
I think he was fit. I don't think it's a psychiatrist's job to say otherwise. He was one of these men that was used, a man for all seasons. The good guys do all the hard work and do burn out. And of course Napoleon, perhaps we should question whether Napoleon was fit to serve at that time. But of course Ney, if he failed, he'd have a great scapegoat. My feeling is that during the course of the battle, for a brief period, he experienced, I would use the term combat exhaustion. He developed tunnel vision and he reverted to type as a very junior soldier rather than functioned as a leader. In that sense, he was suffering a temporary psychological disorder that we would probably now call battle shock.
The discussion casts important new light on the part Ney would play in the last act of the battle. Around 7:30 in the evening, Waterloo reaches its final dramatic climax. After marching all day to the sound of the guns, Prussian troops have now linked up with the Allies. Time is running out for Napoleon, and his only chance is to commit the last precious reserve.
All he has left now is the Imperial Guard. The Guard have never been beaten. They're the cream of the French army, and provided they're properly used, they still just might pull victory from the jaws of defeat.
He's only going to commit the Imperial Guard at the absolute crisis of the battle. Because if he loses them, he loses the empire. And so when the decision is made to commit the Guard, this is the crucial moment. There's no going back from this. You've got to win.
The final moments would reflect the problems Napoleon had faced throughout the whole battle. His artillery had failed against Allied troops protected by the reverse slope and soft ground. What troops he had left after years of attrition had been wasted in rash, uncoordinated attacks. Now the Imperial Guard, his last reserve, would have to attack over deceptively tough terrain, selected by a master of defensive warfare. Struggling up the difficult, muddy slope, they would have faced point-blank artillery fire, round shot and canister. Finally, command of this critical last attack was handed to a man likely suffering from battle shock, Marshal Ney. Napoleon could only look on helplessly as Ney, yelling and screaming, led the column into the dense smoke which cloaked the Allied ridge.
Noise, you can't see anything, you're trying to pick your way across obstacles, force your way through the mud. This is a pretty unpleasant movement they have to do. But they are the Guard. And despite the discharges of canister, despite the chaos, despite the difficulty, they keep going.
As the exhausted French guardsmen reached the crest of the Allied ridge, it seemed for a moment that they had broken through. But suddenly the red wall of Wellington's infantry rose from the reverse slope. From less than 30 yards, the Allied muskets couldn't miss. More than 500 guardsmen fell to the first volley alone. But no soldiers, not even the Imperial Guard, could withstand such murderous firepower. For the first and only time in their history, Napoleon's Imperial Guard broke and fled.
And once the Guards start to retreat down the hill, the whole French army breaks and the whole French army starts to withdraw. And that effectively is the end of the Battle of Waterloo.
With the end of the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's empire passed into legend and a new Europe was born, paid for in the blood of nearly 50,000 French, Allied and Prussian soldiers on the muddy, steep slopes of the Waterloo Ridge.